Since its establishment in 1913, ADL has been a strong voice with the mission of stopping the defamation of the Jewish people and securing justice and fair treatment for all. Consistent with this founding vision, ADL launched in 2018 its task force on Middle East minorities with a mission of educating, advocating, and elevating the issues challenging these important and all too often overlooked communities across the Middle East, including religious, ethnic, sexual, and gender minorities, and other groups who face governmental and societal repression and discrimination. Today, we're proud to co-host this webinar with the Daniel Pearl Foundation. The Daniel Pearl Foundation was established by the family of Wall Street Journal reporter Daniel Pearl, who was kidnapped and murdered by Al-Qaeda affiliated terrorists in Pakistan in 2002. The foundation works to further the ideas that inspired Daniel's life and work with a mission to promote cross-cultural understanding through journalism, music, and innovative communications. Our program today will be split in two sections. First, Farahnaz Ispahani, former Pakistani lawmaker, journalist, ADL Task Force on Middle East Minorities co-chair, and most recently appointed International Panel of Parliamentarians for Freedom of Religion or Belief Steering Committee member, will introduce our topic and conduct an interview with Joel Simon, the Executive Director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Next, we will have an in-depth discussion on this topic with our three expert panelists. First, I'd like to introduce Maziar Bahari, ADL's Daniel Pearl Award recipient from 2018. Maziar is a journalist, the editor of the digital news site IranWire, and the recipient of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's 2020 Elie Wiesel Award. Aykan Erdemir is a senior director of Turkey program at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, FDD. He's a former Turkish lawmaker and an IPPFoRB steering committee member. And last but not least, Samuel Tadros is a senior fellow at Hudson Institute Center for Religious Freedom, a scholar of Middle East politics and Islamist movements, and co-host of the television program Sam and Ammar on the US-funded broadcaster Hurra TV. At this point, I'd like to turn to Farahnaz, who will set us off. Go ahead, Farahnaz.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you all for joining us today for a discussion on the role of state media in promoting hate speech and in targeting vulnerable minorities across the Middle East. We are living in very difficult times. Anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, ethnic and religious hatred are once again raising their ugly heads all over the world. There's been a rise in attacks on minorities in the Middle East. ISIS attempted genocide against the Yazidis and the Christians of Iraq and Syria, targeting and dislocating communities that have lived in the region for centuries. Iran continues to brutally persecute Jews, Christians, and Baha'is and others. Anti-Semitic tropes and negative images of Christians, Jews, and Shia Muslims remain common in Egypt and other Arab countries, as well as in Turkey. The victory of the Taliban in Afghanistan is a major setback for the country's religious minorities. Sikhs, Hindus, Christians, and Hazara communities feel attacked and besieged. The Islamic State in Khorasan, the Afghanistan-Pakistan variant of ISIS, has claimed responsibility for various terrorist attacks on religious minority groups in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. Recently, the FBI has warned that judging by activity on the internet, radical Islamists are being inspired by the Taliban victory this could pose a renewed challenge to religious minorities. We all know that hate is learned behavior. Our focus today is on the ways in which state media enables hateful thinking across the greater Middle East. We will try to talk about both slanted news coverage and tropes in drama and other supposedly entertainment products. The state's political considerations, like opposing Israel for Iran and Erdogan's Turkey, and competition with India for Pakistan, become intertwined with hatred for Jews and Hindus, and anti-Americanism or anti-Western politics becomes the overlay for targeting Christians. Today, I am honored to be talking to Joel Simon, who is the Executive Director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. His writing on media issues have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, the Wall Street Journal, and he is also a regular columnist for the Columbia Journalism Review. Under Joel's leadership, CPJ has been honored with the Thomas J. Dodd Prize in International Justice and Human Rights, a News and Documentary Emmy, and the 2018 Chatham House Prize. His book, The New Censorship Inside the Global Battle for Media Freedom, was published in 2014, while We Want to Negotiate: The Secret World of Kidnapping, Hostages, and Ransom was published in 2018. Joel, welcome to this discussion.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm really grateful for the invitation. And before we begin, I want to both thank the ADL and the Daniel Pearl Foundation, in particular, Yuda Pearl, who's a good friend and reached out to me and invited me to participate.
Thank you. Joel, in an era of social media and so many new diverse outlets, how much control do states still have over what people watch, hear, and think?
I think they have a lot of control, and I think that their control is growing because states have recognized that in the information age, the ability to control narratives, to set narratives, is essential to retaining power. And the old systems through which states maintain control over information, the kind of hierarchical systems where, with state censorship and, censors sitting in a room, putting an X through some columns, that's not going to work in this environment. But states are highly adaptable, and they found ways to both insert themselves into the information space through the creation of state media and the professionalization of state media. It used to be these were, you could spot them a mile away. They just looked like kind of, and they were highly visible as propaganda. Now they're much more sophisticated, of course, which presents some real challenges. And they're also increasingly active, as we know, in the social media space. And they often hide and seek to camouflage their involvement using all sorts of tactics, which we can discuss, from paid posters to bots to other systems and strategies for influencing the way that they're perceived and the way that the public perceives events as they play out in these countries.
How do you, in light of our conversation today, which is linked to religious minority populations, which we have watched dwindling over history, but it's been accelerated, I would say, in recent decades. So how do you see this narrative and this control and this new, as you were saying, smarter way of controlling the media that these authoritarian dictatorships are now employing. How does that affect the religious minority populations?
Well, I think that in every context, polarization and division is becoming an effective political strategy. So where divisions exist, those are exploited, and sort of the politics, both in authoritarian and democratic countries, are based on the amplification of difference and division. So the state media is playing into that. These you know, the way in which governments and government-allied organizations are using social media to, again, exploit difference is, you know, it's kind of at the heart of modern politics. And because politics now are very often not about building the center or creating a kind of, you know, middle point where you can build the broadest possible coalition, it's about mobilizing people on the extremes. And so, you know, targeting minorities and playing to kind of historic tropes and amplifying hatred are very effective strategies in many places around the world.
Jewel, to go back to what you were starting to explain to us about some of the new methods that are being employed by both authoritarian and, as you pointed out, democratic nations. What are some of the new ways that they are employing to suppress, oppress, or, you know, just deny messages?
You know, I want to take a little bit of a step back from that and kind of talk about a trap that we need to be very careful of when we're looking at the way in which governments are operating in this space. So what they are doing, and it's very dangerous, is they're kind of hiding behind the mantle of free expression. So sometimes these governments are developing sophisticated state-run media operations that say 90% of what they broadcast could be classified as legitimate news, and 10% is, you know, rhetoric that's intended to incite division, or may not, or may be completely false, or what have you, or is clearly propaganda. But the challenge, the sophisticated part of this is that if governments overreact, other governments, for example, to the way in which the states are sort of exploiting the media system, that it creates an opening for them to crack down on their own domestic media or other international media operations that are legitimate. So let me give you an example to just point out this trap. So everyone, I'm sure, is familiar with RT, which is the, you know, Kremlin-backed media operation, which is, as I mentioned, a sort of hybrid media / propaganda. And one of the ways that the US government responded to that was, there's a law in the United States called the Foreign Agent Registration Act that requires that media that's basically, you know, or communication that's basically government communication has to be identified as such. And so they, you know, they basically, the US Justice Department applied the Foreign Registration Act to RT. How did Russia respond to this? It basically was handed this incredibly powerful framework to crack down on the domestic media in Russia, the independent domestic media, which is many of which receive grants from foreign, from international foundations, for example, and to apply this law that said you must now register as a foreign agent. And the Russian government has basically said, this is reciprocal. We're doing this just because, you know, the US did this to RT. And it's frankly a strategy that's really backfired, because the labeling RT under the Foreign Agent Registration Act has not really curtailed RT's activities in the US, but it's provided a perfect framework for Russia to crack down on its own domestic media and claim it's acting in a reciprocal manner. So the challenge here that's really enormous is that this kind of state-sponsored media or propaganda, or sometimes like polarizing communication, is really, really damaging. But if governments overreact and respond in ways that sort of fall into this trap, then it could end up handing the governments that you're trying to target the perfect tool to actually amplify repression and control speech.
Absolutely. And as you were talking about, a lot of, and not just journalists, but human rights defenders, for example, NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, and many groups like that who had been helping legitimate Russians, you know, in their search for expression of all kinds, was so harshly dealt with after that. So basically, you are saying something which for a lot of us who are human rights defenders, you know, who always think that perhaps the West or the democratic countries of the world should speak out and should get involved in condemnation. So do you think condemnation is important, but not using something like FARA, for example? A legal
I think the challenge is to think of this issue in all its complexity. So first of all, the underlying premise of this whole discussion is absolutely clear, and that is that the effect of this kind of polarizing media that is intended to target vulnerable minorities in many instances and amplify difference and, you know, produce more strife and the danger that it poses is very real. But the question is, what are the ways in which governments that are concerned about this can respond without actually exacerbating the problem? I think speaking out and condemn, you know, more speech is always positive. I mean, consumers of information around the world have become very sophisticated. So if governments, you know, use crude strategies and try and, you know, kind of present themselves as legitimate media when they're clearly government entities, that often doesn't work. People can see through that. So there has to be some credibility and thought given to, you know, the way in which you counter this speech. But where I see a lot of unintended negative consequences are when governments actually step in, and even when they might have a legal basis for doing so, restrict this speech, even when it's illegitimate, because it usually is ineffective, but it then hands the government, the other government, the opportunity to claim that their repression is based on a reciprocal response. Very challenging.
It is. I want to sort of end our conversation today, unless you have anything specific you would like to add to our topic. Is there anything, Joel?
Well, you know, there is one thing I want to mention. We were talking about it before, but I think it is important just to sort of recognize that our friends and colleagues who received the Nobel Peace Prize, Maria Ressa and Dmitry Muratov, and they are, you know, the issues we're talking about today, you know, the kind of the way in which there's a fight for the information space, who controls it, and how do we as citizens use information to empower ourselves and to engage with governments that are seeking to impose their own structures on the information space. I really think there's like this battle that's taking place that we're right in the middle of it. And so I think it was wonderful that the Nobel Committee recognized two leading fighters for press freedom and freedom of expression.
I absolutely agree. Well, that's one positive and hopeful
It is.
piece of this entire conversation. Joel Simon, thank you so much for joining us today. And I will hand this back to you, Sharon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And thank you, Joel, on behalf of ADL and Farahnaz for conducting such a really substantive interview with Joel, laying out kind of the terrain which we're all engaged in and really trying to raise the issues at hand, which do seem to be quite complex. So at this point, I'd love to turn to our panelists, to Aykan, to Maziar, and to Sam. And let's have a conversation about some of the issues that Joel referenced. And let's also put these issues in the context of the countries and the regions that you all specialize in. Aykan, maybe I'll start with you. As Joel was mentioning, over the last decade, authoritarian regimes have really expanded their capacity to weaponize the media. We've seen that this involves not only building the capacity to use state media outlets, but also transform independent media outlets into quasi-state venues. So could you give us some details about the process that authoritarian regimes use to build hate propaganda capacity, both through state and quasi-state media outlets? And please feel free to use examples from Turkey or the region that you know best.
Thank you, Sharon. And I would also like to thank the ADL Task Force on Middle East Minorities for this timely and very important webinar. Now, this question is a very important one because often we assume hate just goes together with state-owned media and stops there. In fact, what we see is hate is expensive. Propagating hate demands resources, and those resources these days in the Middle East are not only provided by authoritarian regimes to government outlets, but also, as I will try to demonstrate with a few examples, to quasi-state and even private-looking proxy state media. So I would like to divide venues for hate into three, state, quasi-state, and state proxy media. And all these venues happen to be very effective outlets for propagating hate, and they're often part and parcel of one interconnected ecosystem. Let me turn to the example I know the best, Turkey. Now, Turkey has a very strong and well-funded state media. People might be familiar with TRT, which is the public broadcaster, and the TRT World, which is its international face. And this outlet is purely funded by the state. It has huge resources, and it employs a strategy of double messaging, meaning what you get in Turkish is often more outrageous than what you get in English. So you get a doctored version in the English broadcast, but nevertheless, that could also be bordering hate and scapegoating of minorities, whether we're talking about ethnic minorities, religious minorities, or gender minorities. Now, besides the state outlet, we have also quasi-state outlets. For example, Turkey's official news agency, Anadolu Agency, is a quasi-state outlet, meaning it does have private shareholders. In fact, it was established during the early years of the Republic to be an independent media agency outside of state control. But within the last decade, through various machinations, this outlet has become pretty much indistinguishable from a state outlet. And again, we see the double messaging here, meaning what you get in Turkish is often more outrageous than what you get in English. But now I would like to finish with the third category, which I think is the trend that we should be watching for in the next decade, because we're more familiar with propagation of hate through state outlets, but we are, I think, less prepared to deal with private outlets or outlets that pretend to be private, but in fact are proxies for states' propagation of hate. Just to give you one example, in Turkey, during the 2013, 2014 corruption scandals, there were a number of leaked phone records which showed that the Turkish President Erdogan was basically informally taxing crony businesses, that is, ordering businessmen close to him to pay $50 to $100 million ahead to pool resources so that he could take over private media outlets and turn them into proxy media outlets. Now, this is one way of how hate can be propagated through private media. But then the Turkish president developed a second MO, and that is Turkey's state banks started providing multi-billion-dollar loans to crony businesses so they could take over private outlets. Now, to force private outlets into selling their conglomerates to pro-government cronies, Turkey's tax inspectors started issuing multi-billion-dollar fines on these independent outlets. So this was a kind of a double squeeze. On the one hand, through tax fines, you were pushing pro-secular, pro-democracy, independent outlets out of business. And meanwhile, you are providing advantageous state bank loans to crony businesses to take them over. So overall, you end up with a toxic ecosystem where from the state to the quasi-state to the private, you have an ecosystem in harmony, in propagating hate, in scapegoating minorities, and worst of all, in institutionalizing a new media regime whereby independent journalists who still try to survive are forced into self-censorship. That is, for example, in today's Turkey, you have few journalists who are willing to advocate on behalf of vulnerable minorities, knowing that this could land them in jail or expose them to lengthy, expensive lawsuits, frivolous lawsuits. Meanwhile, pro-government columnists get these cushy positions, columns, even in independent media outlets, as bosses, as media bosses, try to hedge their bets to see if they can survive under state repression. So overall, I think as we try to come up with pushback strategies, we have to consider that there is now a completely new ecosystem in the works. So, one strategy we have seen, for example, in the US is forcing the TRT to register as a foreign agent, just like, Russia Today and just like the Chinese state outlets. But ultimately, right now, the Turkish government does most of its hate propaganda not through the foreign agent registered outlets, but through all these other independent outlets. And let me end with the worst example I have, and that is CNN Turk. CNN's Turkish subsidiary, which uses CNN's license, has been implicated multiple times in racist, anti-Kurdish, misogynist, anti-Semitic coverage. But despite repeated appeals by the Turkish public and complaints by the Turkish public, this outlet still continues to be run by an Erdogan crony who received all the funds to purchase the outlet from a Turkish state bank and is now bankrupt, is now in talks, according to Reuters, as of this month, for restructuring loans worth $2 billion. So we also, I think, have to bring in the issue of corruption alongside registering state media to find more effective ways to push back against such propaganda. And this would also mean that we have to consider using global Magnitsky sanctions to target corrupt media bosses who have nothing to do with journalism, but are simply in the business of propagating hate.
Wow, Aykan, you've really obviously drawn a very, very bleak picture of what is happening in Turkey. And to turn to Maziar, obviously the Islamic Republic of Iran is yet another bad actor on the international scene, who is really known as one of the worst offenders in the world of press freedom. So maybe, Maziar, can you tell us a little bit about the threats and challenges that really face the members of the press, both national and international, when they want to cover and report on problems facing vulnerable communities? Maziar, you've written quite a bit about the plight of the Baha'i minority in Iran. So how can responsible international actors better support those really serious journalists who face threats but still are committed to being the voice of the vulnerable communities in many of the countries we're talking about? But if you could refer to Iran specifically in terms of your own work, Maziar. Maziar, you're on mute. Yeah,
yes.
Go ahead.
So thank you very much, Sharon. And I just want to add one thing to what Aykan said about Turkey and the devious nature of the propaganda in Turkey, is that one of the most anti-Semitic TV programs on Turkish TV, The Last Emperor, that Aykan wrote about in Washington Post recently, is co-produced by a company that's based in America. So I think for ADL and other organizations, it will be very good to look into the actions of that company, and which is, not very far from. I mean, it's mostly, I think it's based in Hollywood, and I think that company easily can be subject of at least protest. And going back to Iran, it is, I think the situation for Iranian journalists is becoming more dangerous every day. And with the election or the selection of a new president in Iran, Ebrahim Raisi, it has become even a more dangerous profession. So when a journalist works in Iran, whether for a state news agency, for a state TV or a state newspaper, or a semi-private media outlet, they have to observe certain rules that are written in Iranian press laws and are told to them by their editors and publishers, and also certain hidden rules, certain unwritten rules that every Iranian knows about. For example, when I went back to Iran after being away for 12 years to work as a journalist and documentary filmmaker in Iran in 1997, which was actually the height of free press in Iran during the quote-unquote reformist era, I knew that I could not touch certain subjects. And religious minorities, especially the Baha'is that you mentioned, and the ethnic minorities and ethnic issues in Iran are the reddest of the red line in the country. So you know that you cannot touch those subjects. But it doesn't mean that this discourse is not happening within the society and within the media landscape in Iran. With the advent of digital technology, the internet, and satellite television, we see there's a new, let's say, newly found freedom for discussing this issue. Many Iranians, millions of Iranians maybe, are discussing issues that were taboos in the past in Iran, including the situation of the Baha'is, who are the largest minority group in Iran, and they are regarded as and they're treated as second-class citizens in Iran. But at the same time, within Iran, inside the country, there cannot be any mention of the Baha'i rights or the rights of any religious minority that is not mentioned in the Iranian constitution, according to the Article 13 of Iranian constitution, which only recognizes Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Judaism as official religious minorities in Iran, in addition to Sunni Islam. So for an Iranian journalist to work on these issues, it is very dangerous. They can easily be charged with endangering the security of the nation. And that is the charge that you see most commonly made by different courts. And that can be part of a sentence as well, that if they run out of any real crimes or quote unquote crimes that they can attribute to a journalist, they just charge them or they sentence them for endangering the security of the nation, which is open to interpretation. And it can be determined by an interrogator or it can be by the judge. And again, going back to my own experience, my interrogator, when I was in prison, said very eloquently that the Iranian justice system is an interrogator-based system, meaning that the interrogator decides what is the crime and what should be the punishment, and the judge is just a stamp that goes on the sentence paper. So within that landscape, it is very difficult for neutral or fair journalists, international journalists, to work in Iran as well. If they want to continue working in the country, they either have to self-censor and not touch certain subjects, or they have to just follow the certain colleagues of mine who interviewed certain opposition members in the country, or they talked about different issues in Iran, and they were never given a visa again to visit the country. And sometimes, if they are based in the country, their press accreditation can be easily revoked, and they can be thrown out of the country.
Thank you, Maziar. Really very interesting, kind of looking at the contrasts with Turkey. Perhaps we turn to Sam now and looking at the media environment in Egypt today. Sam, where would you draw the line today between state-run, state-controlled, and really truly private media outlets? Does that exist in Egypt today? And then maybe secondarily, how are minority issues covered in these kind of categories of press? Especially when it comes to the Copt community, and a community that you kind of cover yourself and specialize in. And then is there a real difference between how domestic Egyptian media cover minority issues versus how international foreign media cover minority issues in Egypt? So I would love to have your insight on these.
Thank you, Sharon. And it's a great discussion and always a pleasure to be joining in this conversation. When President Sisi came to power, in one of the recordings that were leaked in the beginning of his ascendance to power, he spoke, or he lamented the fact that one of his predecessors, President Gamal Abdel Nasser, enjoyed a media environment that was supportive of his project. Of course, Gamal Abdel Nasser, under his rule, there was no free press. No one was allowed to have a different opinion or to express that opinion. So as a result, the state under his control has basically attempted to monopolize the media environment completely, to close the public square to any voices outside of that of the regime. So while there had existed under President Mubarak and during the revolutionary upheaval a number of TV channels that were privately owned, we quickly saw that there was a process by which the Egyptian intelligence service directly created a company that took over those media channels as well as the newspapers that were available. The result today is not just the kind of censorship you see by the regime, but direct ownership by the Egyptian intelligence service to these companies, and thus direct control. This is not just about the television and the newspapers. It also goes to the film industry, for example, where you have, again, the intelligence service creating a company that becomes the sole producer in Egypt because it controls, it has enormous resources, because it signs contracts. It doesn't allow the actors to work with other agencies and companies. So it has completely monopolized the film industry to serve it. Concerning the Copts and how their issues are covered, I think we went through phases. Under Mubarak's rule, there was no reporting on the Coptic issue. There was complete denial that there is a problem in Egypt. But this began to change, especially when Coptic websites based in the United States, Australia, and Canada became the main source of information of things happening inside the country. At a certain moment, the regime realized that it had to allow some coverage in order to be able to counter the narrative that's emerging from this diaspora Coptic community. So we began seeing Egyptian newspapers and the media covering sectarian attacks on Copts. Now, under President Sisi, of course, the regime claims to be protecting Christians and other minorities. It presents itself to the West as one that plays that role, but internally, we've seen some coverage of incidents, but never a serious examination of the problem and the lack of regime action in protecting communities that are vulnerable, that are under attack. So whenever there's a sectarian attack happening, today we see some coverage, but then the blame is always put on the regime's enemies. It's the Muslim Brotherhood's fault. What about the police that didn't do their job in protecting these people being attacked? Or what is the regime doing to bring the perpetrators to justice? There's nothing of the sort in that coverage. In terms of the foreign media, I think the Copts and Middle East minorities in general fall into this blind spot that people don't give much attention to. The groups, the small groups, the rituals, their traditions, their clothes, everything about these communities is perhaps alien to the media coverage that we see in the United States or around the world. When you get a major attack, when there are 10, 15 people killed by the Islamic State, for example, or other entity, you get the news coverage, often just a report by the Associated Press that gets reprinted by everyone or re-reported by everyone. But outside of this, there's very little attention, I think, in the Western press to the real issues happening to these indigenous communities that have been living in the regions for thousands of years and that suffer at the hands of those regimes. Lastly, of course, the issue of anti-Semitism is of particular concern. The Egyptian media, though that directly owned by the regime or owned by the intelligence, spreads all kinds of conspiracy theories, anti-Semitic tropes about Jews. There are programs dedicated to covering Jewish issues, Israeli issues, that are filled with anti-Semitic content and that gets also reprinted in the newspapers that you have. So in that part in particular, maybe in the case of Copts, we don't see this kind of clear language. We see it, of course, from Islamist websites, but these are non-state actors. But in terms of anti-Semitism, the state has a direct role that it does in spreading that hate.
Sam, while I have you, can you also address kind of the role of a media organization like Al Jazeera, both in terms of how it impacts how events are covered inside Egypt and how their coverage and their narrative of regional issues impact kind of Egyptian audiences? Kind of talks to us a little bit about Al Jazeera specifically when it comes to Egypt.
Sure. I mean, the first thing obviously to say about Al Jazeera is that it is a Qatari state-owned media, and thus it serves Qatari foreign policy. It's not in any form or shape an independent news organization, although it pretends to be one, and certainly in its English language reporting attempts to portray itself as an independent source of information. But the role of Al Jazeera basically is to serve the Qatari foreign policy. And for the past 2 decades, that Qatari foreign policy has been based on an alliance with Islamist elements across the region. The rationale, which seemed to them to make sense, was that these were the people with street credentials, that they're the ones, they represented the masses, and thus the Qatar would be best served by allying with these. As a result, not just the programs that you have at Al Jazeera, but the very employees that work in Al Jazeera and produce these programs are often people that belong to these Islamist movements, to Hamas, to the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, to other Islamist organizations across the region, especially those associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. When it came to its coverage in Egypt, it has obviously been related to that struggle between the Muslim Brotherhood and the Egyptian regime, in which both Al Jazeera, the main channel, as well as the specific channel that they created for Egypt, Al Jazeera Mubashir Masr, has been basically a Muslim Brotherhood mouthpiece, talking about all the issues in Egypt from the Muslim Brotherhood's perspective. Now, obviously, the Muslim Brotherhood there are real concerns about human rights and all of these in Egypt, but as part of that narrative, particularly problematic for us, is the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamists' attempt to blame the religious minorities for everything happening. So instead of the fight being between them and the regime only, there's always an attempt to bring in the religious minorities. So Sisi is an evil person because his mother is a Moroccan Jew. There's a protest against the Brotherhood when they rule. It's Copts that lead them. It is the Christians that help the coup against the regime. All of this narrative focusing on both Jews and Christians attempts to blame them and scapegoat them to the real problems that the Muslim Brotherhood has had and to the struggle that it is having with the Egyptian regime. And of course, Al Jazeera is not alone. It might be the most popular channel, but that also, I think it's important to mention, the Iranian channel in Arabic, Al Alam, which has a huge following as well. The Turks are also attempting to build a competitor at the moment, and the Russia RT Arabic, all three outlets specialize in spreading conspiracy theories, fake news, stories that basically do not help creating a free press or a media environment that allows people to formulate opinions and to learn about the world.
Thank you, Sam. Really, really interesting. Maziar, coming back to you and kind of building on what Sam just presented, obviously, targeting of Jews serves many, many different agendas. And the Iranian regime actually has been probably one of the most effective in using anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial to propagate kind of its own narrative. Talk to us a little bit about how the Iranian regime exploits the media to kind of marginalize and scapegoat Jewish communities. What is it about, for example, denying the Holocaust that serves this regime? Why is that such a powerful weapon? And how does, your outlet like IranWire push back against this? Talk to us a little bit about kind of what you're doing at IranWire and how you're really standing up in terms of the propagating of this level of hate.
Yeah, I think we have to start by saying that Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism, they're really Western phenomena, and they are imported into the Middle East by different people. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was written in Russia and then translated into German and French and English, and then it was translated into Arabic, and now you have several translations in Arabic and Persian. And What we can say about the use of Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism in Iran, which somehow is sometimes it's concealed as anti-Israeli or anti-Zionist sentiments, is that the regime tries to address certain supporters, certain of its supporters, not all of its supporters, who have grown up by listening to different anti-Semitic speeches by different mullahs, the Holocaust denial by different groups of people inside Iran. But from my experience, anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial is not something that is, let's say, popular among Iranian people. And it is very much something that the government, or at least part of the government, tries to peddle. If you go to Syria or Egypt and different places, you can see that there are several books, anti-Semitic books, as I said, Protocols of Elders of Zion are just being sold on the streets regularly. And when you talk to different artists and intellectual in many countries in the Middle East, outside of Iran, you can hear many anti-Semitic sentiments, even among the most cultivated groups of people, but that does not exist in Iran. So this discrepancy between the public's understanding of Jewish people inside Iran who've been living in Iran for the past 2,500 years, and people's respect for Jewish cultures, people's respect for peaceful coexistence between Iran and Israel, and the line that the government, or at least part of the government, wants to peddle, makes part of the government, part of the Iranian system, try as hard as it can to peddle that line, to peddle Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism, sometimes in very exaggerated and obscene ways that are even criticized by many people within the Iranian government. One example was the Holocaust cartoon exhibition. That's, we have had anti-Semites in different parts of the world, but they never thought of such an obscene idea as organizing Anne Frank, a cartoon exhibition that shows Anne Frank in bed with Hitler, for example. Or Ahmadinejad, former President Ahmadinejad, who these days pretends to be part of the opposition, inviting all the anti-Semites from different parts of the world, including David Duke, to Iran for a World Without Israel gathering. So it's a very complicated anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial in Iran. It's a very, very complicated issue. It is a constant battle between parts of the Iranian government that tries to push this line, push the anti-Semitic and Holocaust denial propaganda, and the majority of Iranian government, Iranian people, and part of the Iranian government who do not want this line to be peddled, and in many cases, they try to resist it. So in IranWire, the publication that I started with some friends a few years ago, we tried to talk about this issue as openly and as objectively as possible. So since a few years ago, with the help of US Holocaust Memorial Museum, we have been talking about different issues related to the Holocaust. We have started a project called Sardari Project, which is named after Abdul Hossein Sardari, who was an Iranian diplomat during the Second World War, who saved many hundreds of Jews, Iranian Jews and non-Iranian Jews in Paris by giving them false passports, fake passports. And what we try to do is that we try to talk about the Holocaust as as a historical crime that everyone has to learn about, and everyone has to know different aspects of the Holocaust, not only of the crime itself, which happened after Wannsee Conference in 1942, but also what led to Adolf Hitler coming to power. What were the Nazi policies in terms of propaganda, in terms of passing new laws? And for better or, for different reasons, many people, most of the time inaccurately, they compare the Iranian regime to the Nazi regime. There are certain similarities, of course, between different authoritarian dictatorial regimes. So we try to talk about what was the Nazi regime, what were the Nazi laws, what was the Nazi propaganda, how did Adolf Hitler manage to rule millions of very educated, civilized Germans and commit one of the most heinous crimes in the history of mankind. So I'm sorry that I didn't give you a very simple answer, but the answer is really complicated, and it's as many other answers that I can give you. It's basically boils down to the constant battle between the government of Iran, which somehow lives in maybe 14th century or 1400 years ago, or at best in the 20th century, and the majority of Iranian youth who are very forward-looking, and they live in the 21st century.
Thank you, Maziar. Aykan, I want to kind of end with you, and I know that you have been truly a courageous activist, researcher, really unraveling a lot of important information as you laid out at the opening of this panel. I wanted to ask you if you yourself, friends or family, and this is a question coming from the audience actually in a chat box, have ever been targeted personally, or people you know, by state-run or state-controlled media. And I know that obviously Maziar referenced his unfortunate experience, but tell us a little bit about what does that feel like? And I know you have already our friends who are in Turkey today, and you yourself here, in Washington, D.C. How do you contend with that?
That's a very important topic, but one I feel a little uncomfortable talking about, given I have the privilege to enjoy First Amendments, whereas Turkey remained until recently the world's top jailer of journalists. It has been taken over the last 2 years by China, but still we have many close colleagues in prison. So I would rather like to advocate on their behalf. People who follow my work know that, I have been targeted by the Turkish government, have been criminalized and smeared in Turkey's government or quasi-government media. But this does not compare to many others who has spent and continue to spend years in prison subsequent to such slander and criminalization in state or quasi-state media. And let me give you 2 concrete examples as to how that works. Because as I said before, hate is expensive, but at the same time, hate is also very profitable for governments. So the scapegoating of minorities and dissidents in these outlets offers cover for governments in their economic mismanagement and corruption. So in the Turkish case, for now almost a decade, the Erdogan government has blamed the country's economic problems on what he calls the interest rate lobby. Now, everyone in Turkey knows what this refers to. It's the Jews in Erdogan's parlance, but he doesn't use the Jews. He says the interest rate lobby because he would like to sustain the illusion that he's not anti-Semitic. But there is one case, the case of Osman Kavala. This is Turkey's leading philanthropist devoted to advocating for minority rights in Turkey, shows how anti-Semitic Erdogan has been. Because Osman Kavala was personally targeted by Erdogan. And in doing so, Erdogan said, you know who is behind him? It's that Hungarian Jew Soros. So Kavala became a proxy for Jews, and he has spent now over 4 years in prison, in a maximum security prison, in solitary confinement, without a conviction. In fact, for almost 2 years without an indictment, simply because Erdogan assumed that he was the hidden hand of this global Jewish conspiracy in Turkey. Now, before courts went after Kavala, it was Turkey's state and quasi-state and then crony state, proxy state media that went after Kavala, smeared him, provided him no opportunity for a free and fair trial, and basically disregarded the presumption of innocence in Turkey. Now, we also know that anti-Semitism is not the only MO through which such scapegoating works. And the other very well-known case is that of Pastor Andrew Brunson, because Pastor Brunson, when he spent 2 years, again, in a maximum security prison without an indictment, as Erdogan's hostage, basically, he was smeared as being an element of a fifth column in Turkey. He was framed as a spy, as a coup plotter, as a terrorist, working on behalf of the CIA, and he was implicated in state and quasi-state media for trying to divide Turkey by creating a Christian Kurdistan within Turkey. Now, these were outrageous accusations against a pastor who spent almost 2 decades in Turkey, who had, an impeccable record. But then once you're smeared in these media outlets, you stand no chance of a free and fair trial. Sharon, this I think should remind us as a conclusion that we should build global coalitions to push back against such disinformation and propaganda of hate targeting vulnerable minorities and their allies. And only then, I think we can create a more conducive environment for pluralism and social inclusion to flourish.
Thank you, Aykan, for closing out us in such an eloquent way. I can tell you that we at ADL are really committed to this campaign and to the advocacy required to speak up on behalf of vulnerable minorities in the Middle East, and really with task force members such as yourself and Maziar and Sam, we hope that we can be effective and impactful in this kind of advocacy. With that, I really want to thank Joel. I want to thank Farahnaz, Maziar, Sam, Aykan, all of you for sharing your expertise, your insights. We want to thank everyone on the call for joining us today, and please stay tuned for updates from ADL and from the Task Force on Middle East Minorities and future programming. Thank you for joining us.